This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Alarms and Discursions by G. K. Chesterton. Section 5, Chapters 13 through 15. A Criminal Head. When men of science, or more often men who talk about science, speak of studying history or human society scientifically, they always forget that there are two quite distinct questions involved. It may be that certain facts of the body go with certain facts of the soul, but it by no means follows that a grasp of such facts of the body goes with a grasp of the things of the soul. A man may show very learnedly that certain mixtures of race make a happy community, but he may be quite wrong (he generally is) about what communities are happy. A man may explain scientifically how a certain physical type involves a really bad man, but he may be quite wrong (he generally is) about which sort of man is really bad. Thus his whole argument is useless, for he understands only one half of the equation. The drearier kind of Don may come to me and say, "Celts are unsuccessful. Look at Irishmen, for instance." To which I should reply, "You may know all about Celts, but it is obvious that you know nothing about Irishmen. The Irish are not in the least unsuccessful, unless it is unsuccessful to wander from their own country over a great part of the earth, in which case the English are unsuccessful too." A man with a bumpy head may say to me, as a kind of New Year greeting, "Fools have microcephalous skulls," or what not. To which I shall reply, in order to be certain of that, you must be a good judge both of the physical and of the mental fact. It is not enough that you should know a microcephalous skull when you see it. It is also necessary that you should know a fool when you see him, and I have a suspicion that you do not know a fool when you see him, even after the most lifelong and intimate of all forms of acquaintanceship. The trouble with most sociologists, criminologists, etc., is that while their knowledge of their own detail is exhaustive and subtle, their knowledge of man and society, to which these are to be applied, is quite exceptionally superficial and silly. They know everything about biology, but almost nothing about life. Their ideas of history, for instance, are simply cheap and uneducated. Thus some famous and foolish professor measured the skull of Charlotte Corday to ascertain the criminal type. He had not historical knowledge enough to know that if there is any criminal type, certainly Charlotte Corday had not got it. The skull, I believe, afterwards turned out not to be Charlotte Corday's at all, but that is another story. The point is that the poor old man was trying to match Charlotte Corday's mind with her skull without knowing anything whatever about her mind. But I came yesterday upon yet more crude and startling example. In a popular magazine there is one of the usual articles about criminology, about whether wicked men could be made good if their heads were taken to pieces. As by far the wickedest men I know are much too rich and powerful ever to submit to the process, the speculation leaves me cold. I always notice with pain, however, a curious absence of the portraits of living millionaires from such galleries of awful examples. Most of the portraits in which we are called upon to remark the line of the nose or the curve of the forehead appear to be the portraits of ordinary sad men, who stole because they were hungry or killed because they were in a rage. The physical peculiarity seems to vary infinitely. Sometimes it is the remarkable square head, sometimes it is the unmistakable round head, sometimes the learned draw attention to the abnormal development, sometimes to the striking deficiency of the back of the head. I have tried to discover what is the invariable factor, the one permanent mark of the scientific criminal type. After exhaustive classification, I have come to the conclusion that it consists in being poor. But it was among the pictures in this article that I received the final shock, the enlightenment which has left me in lasting possession of the fact that criminologists are generally more ignorant than criminals. Among the starved and bitter but quite human faces was one head, neat but old-fashioned, with the powder of the 18th century and a certain almost prim pertness in the dress which marked the conventions of the upper middle class about 1790. The face was lean and lifted stiffly up, the eyes stared forward with a frightful sincerity, the lip was firm with heroic firmness, all the more pathetic because of its force. Without knowing who it was, one could have guessed that it was a man in the manner of Shakespeare's Brutus, a man of piercingly pure intentions, prone to use government as a mere machine for morality, very sensitive to the charge of inconsistency, and a little too proud of his own clean, honourable life. I say I should have known this almost from the face alone, if I had not known who it was. But I did know who it was. It was Robespierre. And underneath the portrait of this pale and too eager moralist were written these remarkable words: "Deficiency of ethical instincts," followed by something to the effect that he knew no mercy, which is certainly untrue, and by some nonsense about a retreating forehead, a peculiarity which he shared with Louis XVI and with half the people of his time and ours. Then it was that I measured the staggering distance between the knowledge and the ignorance of science. Then I knew that all criminology might be worse than worthless, because of its utter ignorance of that human material of which it is supposed to be speaking. The man who could say that Robespierre was deficient in ethical instincts is a man utterly to be disregarded in all calculations of ethics. He might as well say that John Bunyan was deficient in ethical instincts. You may say that Robespierre was morbid and unbalanced, and you may say the same of Bunyan. But if these two men were morbid and unbalanced, they were morbid and unbalanced by feeling too much about morality, not by feeling too little. You may say, if you like, that Robespierre was, in a negative sort of way, mad. But if he was mad on ethics. He had a company of keen and pugnacious men, intellectually impatient of unreason and wrong, resolved that Europe should not be choked up in every channel by oligarchies and state secrets that already stank. The work was the greatest that was ever given to men to do, except that which Christianity did, in dragging Europe out of the abyss of barbarism after the Dark Ages. But they did it, and no one else could have done it. Certainly we could not do it. We're not ready to fight all Europe on a point of justice. We're not ready to fling our most powerful class as mere refuse to the foreigner. We're not ready to shatter the great states at a stroke. We're not ready to trust ourselves in an awful moment of utter dissolution in order to make all things seem intelligible and all men feel honourable henceforth. We are not strong enough to be as strong as Danton. We are not strong enough to be as weak as Robespierre. There is only one thing, it seems, that we can do. Like a mob of children, we can play games upon this ancient battlefield. We can pull up the bones and skulls of the tyrants and martyrs of that unimaginable war, and we can chatter to each other childlessly and innocently about skulls that are imbecile and heads that are criminal. I do not know whose heads are criminal, but I think I know whose are imbecile. The Wrath of the Roses. The position of the rose among flowers is like that of the dog among animals. It is so much that both are domesticated as that have some dim feeling that they were always domesticated. There are wild roses and there are wild dogs. I do not know the wild dogs. Wild roses are very nice. But nobody ever thinks of either of them if the name is abruptly mentioned in a gossip or a poem. On the other hand, there are tame tigers and tame cobras, But if one says, "I have a cobra in my pocket," or "there is a tiger in the music room," the adjective "tame" has to be somewhat hastily added. If one speaks of beasts, one thinks first of wild beasts. If of flowers, one thinks first of wild flowers. But there are two great exceptions, caught so completely into the wheel of man's civilization, entangled so unalterably with his ancient emotions and images, that the artificial product seems more natural than the natural. The dog is not a part of natural history, but of human history; and the real rose grows in a garden. All must regard the elephant as something tremendous but tamed; and many, especially in our great cultured centres, regard every bull as presumably a mad bull. In the same way we think of most garden trees and plants as fierce creatures of the forest or morass, taught at last to endure the curb. But with the dog and the rose this instinctive principle is reversed. With them we think of the artificial as the archetype, the earth born as the erratic exception. We think vaguely of the wild dog as if he had run away, like the stray cat; and we cannot help fancying that the wonderful wild rose of our hedges has escaped by jumping over the hedge. Perhaps they fled together, the dog and the rose, a singular and on the whole an imprudent elopement. Perhaps the treacherous dog crept from the kennel, and the rebellious rose from the flower bed, and they fought their way out in company, one with teeth and the other with thorns. Possibly this is why my dog becomes a wild dog when he sees roses, and kicks them anywhere. Possibly this is why the wild rose is called the dog rose. Possibly not. But there is in this degree of dim barbaric truth in the quaint old world legend that I have just invented, that in these two cases the civilized product is felt to be fiercer, nay, even the wilder. Nobody seems to be afraid of a wild dog. He is classed among the jackals and the servile beasts. The terrible cave canem is written over man's creation. When we read "Beware the dog," it means beware of the tame dog; for it is the tame dog that is terrible. He is terrible in proportion as he is tame. It is his loyalty and his virtues that are awful to the stranger, even the stranger within your gates; still more to the stranger halfway over your gates. He is alarmed at such deafening and furious docility. He flees from that great monster of mildness. Well, I have much the same feeling when I look at the roses, rank, red, and thick and resolute round a garden. They seem to me bold and even blustering. I hasten to say that I know even less about my own garden than about anybody else's garden. I know nothing about roses, not even their names. I know only the name Rose, and Rose is, in every sense of the word, a Christian name. It is Christian in the one absolute and primordial sense of Christian, that it comes down from the age of pagans. The rose can be seen and even smelt in Greek, Latin, Provençal, Gothic, Renaissance, and Puritan poems. Beyond this mere word rose, which, like wine and other noble words, is the same in all the tongues of white men, I know literally nothing. I have heard the more evident and advertised names. I know there is a flower which calls itself the glory of Dijon, which I had supposed to be its cathedral. In any case, to have produced a rose and a cathedral is to have produced not only two very glorious and humane images, but also, as I maintain, two very soldierly and defiant things. I also know there is a rose called Marechal Niel. Note once more the military ring. And when I was walking round my garden the other day, I spoke to my gardener, an enterprise of no little valour, and asked him the name of a strange dark rose that had somehow oddly taken my fancy. It was almost as if it reminded me of some turbid element in history and the soul. Its red was not only swarthy but smoky. There was something congested and wrathful about its colour. It was at once theatrical and sulky. The gardener told me it was called Victor Hugo. Therefore it is that I feel all roses to have some secret power about them. Even their names may mean something in connection with themselves in which they differ from nearly all the sons of men. But the rose itself is royal and dangerous. Long as it has remained in the rich house of civilization, it has never laid off its armour. A rose always looks like a mediaeval gentleman of Italy, with a cloak of crimson and a sword, for the thorn is the sword of the rose. And there is this real moral in the matter, that we have to remember that civilization, as it goes on, ought not perhaps to grow more fighting, but ought to grow more ready to fight. The more valuable and reposeful is the order we have to guard, the more vivid should be our ultimate sense of vigilance and potential violence. And when I walk round a summer garden, I can understand how those high, mad lords at the end of the Middle Ages, just before their swords clashed, caught at roses for their instinctive emblems of empire and rivalry. For to me, any such garden is full of the war of the roses. The Gold of Glastonbury. One silver morning I walked into a small grey town of stone, like 20 other grey western towns, which happened to be called Glastonbury, and saw the magic thorn of near 2000 years growing in the open air as casually as any bush in my garden. In Glastonbury, as in all noble and humane things, the myth is more important than the history. One cannot say anything stronger of the strange old tale of St. Joseph and the Thorn than that it dwarfs St. Dunstan. Standing among the actual stones and shrubs, one thinks of the first century and not of the 10th. One's mind goes back beyond the Saxons and beyond the greatest statesmen of the Dark Ages. The tale that Joseph of Arimathea came to Britain is presumably a mere legend, but it is not by any means so incredible or preposterous a legend as many modern people suppose. The popular notion is that the thing is quite comic and inconceivable, as if one said that Wat Taylor went to Chicago or that John Bunyan discovered the North Pole. We think of Palestine as little, localized, and very private, of Christ's followers as poor folk, estric globis, rooted to their towns or trades, and we think of vast routes of travel and constant world communications as things of recent and scientific origin. But this is wrong, at least the last part of it is. It is part of that large and placid lie that the rationalists tell when they say that Christianity arose in ignorance and barbarism. Christianity arose in the thick of a brilliant and bustling cosmopolitan civilization. Long sea voyages were not so quick, but were quite as incessant as today, and though in the nature of things Christ had not many rich followers, it is not unnatural to suppose that he had some, and a Joseph of Arimathea may easily have been a Roman citizen with a yacht that could visit Britain. The same fallacy is employed with the same partisan motive in the case of the Gospel of St. John, which critics say could not have been written by one of the first few Christians because of its Greek transcendentalism and its Platonic tone. I am no judge of the philology, but every human being is divinely appointed judge of the philosophy, and the Platonic tone seems to me to prove nothing at all. Palestine was not a secluded valley of barbarians. It was an open province of a polyglot empire, overrun with all sorts of people of all kinds of education. To take a rough parallel, suppose some great prophet arose among the Boers in South Africa. The prophet himself might be a simple or unlettered man, but no one who knows the modern world would be surprised if one of his closest followers were a professor from Heidelberg or an M.A. from Oxford. All this is not urged here with any notion of proving that the tale of the thorn is not a myth. As I have said, it probably is a myth. It is urged with much more important object of pointing out the proper attitude towards such myths. The proper attitude is one of doubt and hope and a kind of light mystery. The tale is certainly not impossible, as it is certainly not certain. And through all the ages since the Roman Empire, men have fed their healthy fancies with their historical imagination upon the very twilight condition of such tales. But today real agnosticism has declined along with real theology. People cannot leave a creed alone, although it is the essence of a creed to be clear. But neither can they leave a legend alone, though it is the essence of a legend to be vague. That sane half scepticism which was found in all rustics, in all ghost tales and fairy tales, seems to be a lost secret. Modern people must make scientifically certain that St. Joseph did or did not go to Glastonbury, despite the fact that it is now quite impossible to find out, and that it does not, in a religious sense, very much matter. But it is essential to feel that he may have gone to Glastonbury. All songs, arts, and dedications, branching and blossoming like the thorn, are rooted in some such sacred doubt. Taken thus, not heavily like a problem, but lightly like an old tale, the thing does lead one along the road of very strange realities, and the thorn is found growing in the heart of a very secret maze of the soul. Something is really present in the place, some closer contact with the thing which covers Europe but is still a secret. Somehow the great town and the green bush touch across the world the strange small country of the garden and the grave. There is verily some communion between the thorn tree and the crown of thorns. A man never knows what tiny thing will startle him to such ancestral and impersonal tears. Piles of superb masonry will often pass like a common panorama, and on this grey and silver morning the ruined towers of the cathedral stood about me somewhat vaguely like grey clouds. But down in a hollow, where the local antiquaries are making a fruitful excavation, a magnificent old ruffian with a pickaxe, whom I believe to have been St. Joseph of Arimathea, showed me a fragment of the old vaulted roof which he had found in the earth, and on the whitish grey stone there was just a faint brush of gold. There seemed a piercing and sword-like pathos, an unexpected fragrance of all forgotten or desecrated things, in the bare survival of that poor little pigment upon the imperishable rock. To the strong shapes of the Roman and Gothic I had grown accustomed, but that weak touch of colour was at once tawdry and tender, like some popular keepsake. Then I knew that all my fathers were men like me, for the columns and arches were grave and told of the gravity of the builders. But here was one touch of their gaiety. I almost expected it to fade from the stone as I stared. It was as if men had been able to preserve a fragment of a sunset. And then I remembered how the artistic critics have always praised the grave tints and the grim shadows of the crumbling cloisters and abbey towers, and how they themselves often dress up like Gothic ruins in the sombre tones of dim grey walls or dark green ivy. I remember how they hated almost all primary things, but especially primary colours. I knew they were appreciating much more delicately and truly than I the sublime skeletons and the mighty fungoids of the dead Glastonbury. But I stood for an instant alive in the living Glastonbury, gay with gold and coloured like the toy book of a child. The end of chapters 13 through 15. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Alarms and Discursions by G.K. Chesterton. Section 6, Chapters 16 through 18. The Futurists. It was a warm, golden evening, fit for October. I was watching with regret a lot of little black pigs being turned out of my garden, when the postman handed to me, with perfunctory haste which doubtless masked his emotion, the Declaration of Futurism. If you ask me what Futurism is, I cannot tell you. Even the Futurists themselves seem a little doubtful. Perhaps they are waiting for the future to find out. But if you ask me what its declaration is, I answer eagerly, for I can tell you quite a lot about that. It is written by an Italian named Marinetti in a magazine which is called Poesia. It is headed Declaration of Futurism in enormous letters. It is divided off with little numbers and starts straight away like this: 1. We intend to glorify the love of danger, the custom of energy, the strength of daring. 2. The essential elements of our poetry will be courage, audacity, and revolt. 3. Literature having up to now glorified thoughtful immobility, ecstasy, and slumber, we wish to exalt the aggressive movement, the feverish insomnia, running the perilous leap, the cuff and the blow. While I am quite willing to exalt the cuff within reason, it scarcely seems such an entirely new subject for literature as the Futurists imagine. It seems to me that even through the slumber which fills the Siege of Troy, the Song of Roland, and the Orlando Furioso, and in spite of the thoughtful immobility which marks Pantagruel, Henry V, and Ballad of Chevy Chase, there are occasional gleams of an admiration for courage, a readiness to glorify the love of danger, and even the strength of daring. I seem to remember slightly differently spelt somewhere in literature. The distinction, however, seems to be that the warriors of the past went in for tournaments which were at least dangerous for themselves, while the Futurists go in for motor cars which are mainly alarming for other people. It is the Futurist in his motor who does the aggressive movement, but it is the pedestrians who go in for the running and the perilous leap. Section number 4 says, We declare that the splendour of the world has been enriched with a new form of beauty, the beauty of speed. A race automobile adorned with great pipes like serpents with explosive breath, a race automobile which seems to rush over exploding powder, is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace. It is also much easier if you have the money. It is quite clear, however, that you cannot be a Futurist at all unless you are frightfully rich. Then follows this lucid and soul-stirring sentence: We will sing the praises of man holding the flywheel, of which the ideal steering post traverses the earth, impelled itself around the circuit of its own orbit. What a jolly song it would be! So hearty, and with such a simple swing in it. I can imagine the Futurist round the fire in a tavern, trolling out in chorus some ballad with that incomparable refrain, shouting over their swaying flagons some such words as these: A notion came into my head as new as it was bright, that poems might be written on the subject of a fight. No praise was given to Lancelot, Achilles, Nap, or Corbett, but we will sing the praises of man, holding the flywheel of which the ideal steering post traverses the earth, impelled itself around the circuit of its own orbit. Then, least it should be supposed that Futurism would be so weak as to permit any democratic restraints upon the violence and levity of the luxurious classes, there would be a special verse in honour of the motors also. My fathers scaled the mountains in their pilgrimages far, but I feel full of energy while sitting in a car, and petrol is the perfect wine, I lick it and absorb it. So we will sing the praises of man, holding the flywheel of which the ideal steering post traverses the earth, impelled itself around the circuit of its own orbit. Yes, it would be a rollicking catch. I wish there were space to finish the song, or to detail all the other sections in the Declaration. Suffice it to say that Futurism has a gratifying dislike both of liberal politics and Christian morals. I say gratifying because, however unfortunately the cross and the cap of liberty have quarrelled, they are always united in the feeble hatred of such silly megalomaniacs as these. They will glorify war, the only true hygiene of the world, militarism, patriotism, the destructive jester of anarchism, the beautiful ideas which kill, and the scorn of woman. They will destroy museums, libraries, and fight against moralism, feminism, and all utilitarian cowardice. The proclamation ends with an extraordinary passage which I cannot understand at all about something that is going to happen to Mr. Marinetti when he is 40. As far as I can make out, he will then be killed by other poets, who will be overwhelmed with love and admiration for him. They will come against us from afar, from everywhere, leaping on the cadence of their first poems, clawing the air with crooked fingers, and scenting at the Academy gates the good smell of our decaying minds. Well, it is satisfactory to be told, however obscurely, that this sort of thing is coming to an end some day, to be replaced by some other tomfoolery. And though I commonly refrain from clawing the air with crooked fingers, I can assure Mr. Marinetti that this omission does not disqualify me, and that I scent the good smell of his decaying mind all right. I think the only other point of Futurism is contained in this sentence. It is in Italy that we hurl this overthrowing and inflammatory declaration with which today we found Futurism, for we will free Italy from her numberless museums which cover her with countless cemeteries. I think that rather sums it up. The best way, one would think, of freeing oneself from a museum would be not to go there. Mr. Marinetti's fathers and grandfathers freed Italy from prisons and torture chambers, places where people held by force. They, being in bondage of moralism, attacked governments as unjust real governments with real guns. Such was their utilitarian cowardice that they would die in hundreds upon the bayonets of Austria. I can well imagine why Mr. Marinetti in his motor car does not wish to look back at the past. If there was one thing that could make him look smaller even than before, it is that roll of dead men's drums and that dream of Garibaldi going by. The old radical ghosts go by, more real than the living men, to assault I know not what ramparted city in hell. And meanwhile the Futurist stands outside a museum in a warlike attitude, and defiantly tells the official at the turnstile that he will never, never come in. There is a certain solid use in fools. It is not so much that they rush in where angels fear to tread, but rather that they let out what devils intend to do. Some perversion of folly will float about nameless and pervade the whole society. Then some lunatic gives it a name, and henceforth it is harmless. With all really evil things, when the danger has appeared, the danger is over. Now it may be hoped that the self-indulgent sprawlers of Poesia have put a name once and for all to their philosophy. In the case of their philosophy, to put a name to it is to put an end to it. Yet their philosophy has been very widespread in our time. It could hardly have been pointed and finished except by this perfect folly, the creed of which, please God, this is the flower and finish, consists ultimately in this statement, that it is bold and spirited to appeal to the future. Now it is entirely weak and half-witted to appeal to the future. A brave man ought to ask for what he wants, not for what he expects to get. A brave man who wants atheism in the future calls himself an atheist. A brave man who wants socialism, a socialist. A brave man who wants Catholicism, a Catholic. But a weak-minded man who does not know what he wants in the future calls himself a Futurist. They have driven all the pigs away. Oh, that they had driven away the prigs and left the pigs. The sky begins to droop with darkness, and all birds and blossoms to descend unfaltering into the healthy underworld, where things slumber and grow. There was just one true phrase of Mr. Marinetti about himself: the feverish insomnia. The whole universe is pouring headlong to the happiness of the night. It is only the madman who has not the courage to sleep. Dukes. The Duke de Chambertin Pommard was a small but lively relic of a really aristocratic family, the members of which were nearly all atheists up to the time of the French Revolution. But since that event, beneficial in such various ways, had been very devout. He was a royalist, a nationalist, and a perfectly sincere patriot in that particular style which consists of ceaselessly asserting that one's country is not so much in danger as already destroyed. He wrote cheery little articles for the royalist press, entitled "The End of France," or "The Last Cry," or what not, and he gave the final touches to a picture of the Kaiser riding across a pavement of prostrate Parisians with a glow of patriotic exultation. He was quite poor, and even his relations had no money. He walked briskly to all his meals at a little open café, and he looked just like everybody else. Living in a country where aristocracy does not exist, he had a high opinion of it. He would yearn for the swords and the stately manners of the Pommards before the Revolution, most of whom had been in theory republicans. But he turned with a more practical eagerness to the one country in Europe where the tricolour has never flown and men have never been roughly equalized before the state. The beacon and comfort of his life was England, which all Europe sees clearly as the one pure aristocracy that remains. He had, moreover, a mild taste for sport, and kept an English bulldog, and he believed the English to be a race of bulldogs, of heroic squires and hardy yeoman vassals, because he read all this in English Conservative papers written by exhausted little Levantine clerks. But his reading was naturally for the most part in the French Conservative papers, though he knew English well, and it was in these that he first heard of the horrible budget. There he read of the confiscatory revolution planned by the Lord Chancellor of the Exchequer, the sinister Georges Lloyd. He also read how chivalrously Prince Arthur Balfour of Burleigh had defied that demagogue, assisted by Austen, the Lord Chamberlain, and a gay and witty Walter Lang. And being a brisk partisan and a capable journalist, he decided to pay England a special visit and report to his papers upon the struggle. He drove for an eternity in an open fly through beautiful woods, with a letter of introduction in his pocket to one duke who was to introduce him to another duke. The endless and numberless avenues of bewildering pine woods gave him a queer feeling that he was driving through the countless corridors of a dream. Yet the vast silence and freshness healed his irritations at modern ugliness and unrest. It seemed a background fit for the return of chivalry. In such a forest a king and all his court might lose themselves hunting, or a knight-errant might perish with no companion but God. The castle itself, when he reached it, was somewhat smaller than he had expected, but he was delighted with its romantic and castellated outline. He was just about to alight when somebody opened two enormous gates at the side, and the vehicle drove briskly through. "That is not the house?" he inquired politely of the driver. "No, sir," said the driver, controlling the corners of his mouth. "The lodge, sir." "Indeed," said the Duke to Chambertin Pommard. "This is where the Duke's land begins?" "Oh no, sir," said the man, quite in distress. "We've been in his Grace's land all day." The Frenchman thanked him and leant back in the carriage, feeling as if everything were incredibly huge and vast, like Gulliver in the country of the Brobdingnags. He got out in front of a long façade of a somewhat severe building, and a little careless man in a shooting jacket and knickerbockers ran down the steps. He had a weak, fair moustache and dull blue babyish eyes. His features were insignificant, but his manner extremely pleasant and hospitable. This was the Duke of Aylesbury, perhaps the largest landowner in Europe, and known only as a horse breeder until he began to write abrupt little letters about the budget. He led the French Duke upstairs, taking trivialities in a hearty way, and there presented him to another and more important English oligarch, who got up from a writing desk with a slightly senile jerk. He had a gleaming bald head and glasses. The lower part of his face was masked with a short dark beard, which did not conceal a beaming smile, not unmixed with sharpness. He stooped a little as he ran, like some sedentary head clerk or cashier, and even without the cheque book and papers on his desk he would have given the impression of a merchant or man of business. He was dressed in a light grey check jacket. He was the Duke of Windsor, the great Unionist statesman. Between these two loose, amiable men the little Gaul stood erect in his black frock coat with the monstrous gravity of French ceremonial good manners. This stiffness led the Duke of Windsor to put him at his ease like a tenant, and he said, rubbing his hands, "I was delighted with your letter, delighted. I shall be very pleased if I can give you any details." "My visit," said the Frenchman, "scarcely suffices for the scientific exhaustion of detail. I seek only the idea. The idea, that is always the immediate thing." "Quite so," said the other rapidly, "quite so. The idea." Feeling somehow that it was his turn, the English Duke having done all that could be required of him, Pommard had to say, "I mean the idea of aristocracy. I regard this as the last great battle for the idea. Aristocracy, like any other thing, must justify itself to mankind. Aristocracy is good because it preserves a picture of human dignity in a world where that dignity is often obscured by servile necessities. Aristocracy alone can keep a certain high reticence of soul and body, a certain noble distance between the sexes." The Duke of Aylesbury, who had a clouded recollection of having squirted soda water down the neck of a countess on the previous evening, looked somewhat gloomy, as if lamenting the theoretic spirit of the Latin race. The elder Duke laughed heartily and said, "Well, well, you know, we English are horribly practical. With us the great question is the land. Out here in the country. Do you know this part?" "Yes, yes," cried the Frenchman eagerly. "I see what you mean. The country, the old rustic life of humanity. A holy war upon the bloated and filthy towns. What right have these anarchists to attack your busy and prosperous countrysides? Have they not thriven under your management? Are not the English villages always growing larger and gayer under the enthusiastic leadership of their encouraging squires? Have you not the Maypole? Have you not Merry England?" The Duke of Aylesbury made a noise in his throat, and then said very indistinctly, They all go to London." "All go to London?" repeated Pommard with a blank stare. "Why?" This time nobody answered, and Pommard had to attack again. The spirit of aristocracy is essentially opposed to the greed of the industrial cities. Yet in France there are actually one or two nobles so vile as to drive coal and gas trades, and drive them hard. The Duke of Windsor looked at the carpet. The Duke of Aylesbury went and looked out of the window. At length the latter said, "That's rather stiff, you know. One has to look after one's own business in town as well." "Do not say it," cried the little Frenchman, starting up. "I tell you all Europe is one fight between business and honour. If we do not fight for honour, who will? What other right have we two poor-legged sinners to titles and quartered shields, except that we staggeringly support some idea of giving things which cannot be demanded and avoiding things which cannot be punished? Our only claim is to be a wall across Christendom against the Jew peddlers and pawnbrokers, against the Goldsteins and the—" The Duke of Aylesbury swung round with his hands in his pockets. "Oh, I say," he said, "you've been reading Lloyd George. Nobody but dirty Radicals can say a word against Goldstein." "I certainly cannot permit," said the elder Duke, rising rather shakily, "the respected name of Lord Goldstein." He intended to be impressive, but there was something in the Frenchman's eye that is not so easily impressed. There shone there that steel which is the mind of France. "Gentlemen," he said, "I think I have all the details now. You have ruled England for 400 years. By your own account you have not made the countryside endurable to men. By your own account you have helped the victory of vulgarity and smoke. And by your own account you are hand and glove with those very money grubbers and adventurers whom gentlemen have no other business but to keep at bay. I do not know what your people will do, but my people would kill you." Some seconds afterward he had left the Duke's house, and some hours afterward the Duke's estate. The Glory of Grey. I suppose that, taking this summer as a whole, people will not call it an appropriate time for praising the English climate. But for my part I will praise the English climate till I die, even if I die of the English climate. There is no weather so good as English weather. Nay, in a real sense, there is no weather at all anywhere but in England. In France you have much sun and some rain. In Italy you have hot winds and cold winds. In Scotland and Ireland you have rain, either thick or thin. In America you have hells of heat and cold. And in the tropics you have sunstrokes varied by thunderbolts. But all these you have on a broad and brutal scale, and you settle down into contentment or despair. Only in our own romantic country do you have the strictly romantic thing called weather, beautiful and changing as a woman. The great English landscape painters, neglected now like everything that is English, have this salient distinction, that the weather is not the atmosphere of their pictures, it is the subject of their pictures. They paint portraits of the weather sat to Constable, the weather posed for Turner, and a deuce of a pose it was. This cannot truly be said of the greatest of their continental models or rivals. Poussin and Claude painted objects, ancient cities, or perfect Arcadian shepherds through a clear medium of the climate. But in the English painters weather is the hero, with Turner an Adelphi hero, taunting, flashing, and fighting, melodramatic but really magnificent. The English climate, a tall and terrible protagonist, robed in rain and thunder and snow and sunlight, fills the whole canvas and the whole foreground. I admit the superiority of many other French things besides French art, but I will not yield an inch on the superiority of English weather and weather painting. Why, the French have not even got a word for weather, and you must ask for the weather in French as if you were asking for the time in English. Then again, variety of climate should always go with stability of abode. The weather in the desert is monotonous, and as a natural consequence the Arabs wander about, hoping it may be different somewhere. But an Englishman's house is not only his castle, it is his fairy castle. Clouds and colours of every varied dawn and eve are perpetually touching and turning it from clay to gold, or from gold to ivory. There is a line of woodland beyond a corner of my garden which is literally different on every one of 365 days. Sometimes it seems as near as a hedge, and sometimes as far as a faint and fiery evening cloud. The same principle, by the way, applies to the difficult problem of wives. Variability is one of the virtues of a woman. It avoids the crude requirement of polygamy. So long as you have one good wife, you're sure to have a spiritual harem. Now, among the heresies that are spoken in this matter is the habit of calling a grey day a colourless day. Grey is a colour, and can be a very powerful and pleasing colour. There is also an insulting style of speech about one grey day just like another. You might as well talk about one green tree just like another. A grey clouded sky is indeed a canopy between us and the sun. So is a green tree, if it comes to that. But the grey umbrellas differ as much as the green in their style and shape, in their tint and tilt. One day may be grey like steel, another grey like dove's plumage. One may seem grey like the deathly frost, and another grey like the smoke of substantial kitchens. No things could seem further apart than the doubt of grey and the decision of scarlet. Yet grey and red can mingle as they do in the morning clouds, and also in a sort of warm smoky stone, of which they build the little towns in the West Country. In those towns even the houses that are wholly grey have a glow in them, as if their secret firesides were such furnaces of hospitality as faintly to transfuse the walls like walls of cloud. And wandering in those westland parts, I did once really find a signpost pointing up a steep crooked path to a town that was called Clouds. I did not climb up to it. I feared that either the town would not be good enough for the name, or I should not be good enough for the town. Anyhow, the little hamlets of the warm grey stone have a geniality which is not achieved by all the artistic scarlet of the suburbs, as if it were better to warm one's hands at the ashes of Glastonbury than at the painted flames of Croydon. Again, the enemies of grey, those astute, daring, and evil-minded men, are fond of bringing forward the argument that colours suffer in grey weather, and that strong sunlight is necessary to all the hues of heaven and earth. Here again there are two words to be said, and it is essential to distinguish. It is true that sun is needed to burnish and bring into bloom the tertiary and dubious colours, the colours of peat, pea soup, impressionist sketches, brown velvet coats, olives, grey and blue slates, the complexions of vegetarians, the tints of volcanic rock, chocolate cocoa, mud, soot, slime, old boots. The delicate shades of these do need the sunlight to bring out the faint beauty that often clings to them. But if you have a healthy negro taste in colour, if you choke your garden with poppies and geraniums, if you paint your house sky blue and scarlet, if you wear, let us say, a golden top hat and a crimson frock coat, you will not only be visible on the greyest day, but you will notice that your costume and environment produce a certain singular effect. You will find, I mean, that rich colours actually look more luminous on a grey day, because they are seen against a sombre background and seem to be burning with a lustre of their own. Against the dark sky all flowers look like fireworks. There is something strange about them, at once vivid and secret, like flowers traced in a fire in the phantasmal garden of a witch. A bright blue sky is necessarily the high light of the picture, and its brightness kills all the bright blue flowers. But on a grey day the larkspur looks like fallen heaven, the red daisies are really the red lost eyes of day, and the sunflower is the vice-regent of the sun. Lastly, there is this value about the colour that men call colourless, that it suggests in some way the mixed and troubled average of existence, especially in its quality of strife and expectation and promise. Grey is a colour that always seems on the eve of changing to some other colour, of brightening into blue or blanching into white, or bursting into green and gold. So we may be perpetually reminded of the indefinite hope that is in doubt itself, and when there is grey weather in our hills or grey hairs in our head, perhaps they may still remind us of the morning. The end of chapters 16 through 18. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Alarms and Discursions by G.K. Chesterton. Section 7. Chapters 19 through 21. The Anarchist. I have now lived for about 2 months in the country, and have gathered the last rich autumnal fruit of a rural life, which is a strong desire to see London. Artists living in my neighbourhood talk rapturously of the rolling liberty of the landscape, the living peace of woods. But I say to them, with a slight Buckinghamshire accent, "Ah, that is how Cockneys feel. For us real old country people, the country is reality. It is the town that is romance. Nature is as plain as one of her pigs, as commonplace, as comic, and as healthy. But civilization is full of poetry, even if it be sometimes an evil poetry. The streets of London are paved with gold, that is, with the very poetry of avarice. With these typically bucolic words I touch my hat and go ambling away on a stick with the stiffness of gait proper to the oldest inhabitants, while in my more animated moments I am taken for the village idiot, exchanging heavy but courteous salutations with other gaffers. I reach the station, where I ask for a ticket for London, where the King lives. Such a journey, mingled of provincial fascination and fear, did I successfully perform only a few days ago, and alone and helpless in the capital, found myself in the tangle of roads around the Marble Arch. A faint prejudice may possess the mind that I have slightly exaggerated my rusticity and remoteness. And yet it is true, as I came to that corner of the park, that, for some unreasonable reason of mood, I saw all London as a strange city, and the civilization itself as one enormous whim. The Marble Arch itself, in its new insular position, with traffic turning dizzily all about it, struck me as a placid monstrosity. What could be wilder than to have a huge arched gateway with people going everywhere except under it? If I took down my front door and stood it up all by itself in the middle of my back garden, my village neighbours, in their simplicity, would probably stare. Yet the Marble Arch is now precisely that, an elaborate entrance, and the only place by which no one can enter. By the new arrangement its last weak pretence to be a gate has been taken away. The cabman still cannot drive through it, but he can have the delights of riding round it, and even on foggy nights the rapture of running into it. It has been raised from the rank of a fiction to the dignity of an obstacle. As I began to walk across a corner of the park, this sense of what is strange in cities began to mingle with some sense of what is stern as well as strange. It was one of those queer coloured winter days when a watery sky changes to pink and grey and green like an enormous opal. The trees stood up grey and angular, as if in attitudes of agony, and here and there on benches under the trees sat men as grey and angular as they. It was cold even for me, who had eaten a large breakfast and purposed to eat a perfectly gargantuan lunch. It was colder for the men under the trees, and to the eastward through the opalescent haze the warmer whites and yellows of the houses in Park Lane shone as unsubstantially as if the clouds themselves had taken on the shape of mansions to mock the men who sat there in the cold. But the mansions were real, like the mockery. No one worth calling a man allows his moods to change his convictions. But it is by moods that we understand other men's convictions. The bigot is not he who knows he is right. Every sane man knows he is right. The bigot is he whose emotions and imagination are too cold and too weak to feel how it is that other men go wrong. At that moment I felt vividly how men might go wrong, even unto dynamite, if one of those huddled men under the trees had stood up and asked for rivers of blood. It would have been erroneous, but not irrelevant. It would have been appropriate and in the picture, that lurid grey picture of insolence on one side and impotence on the other. It may be true, on the whole it is, that this social machine which we have made is better than anarchy. Still it is a machine, and we have made it. It does hold those poor men helpless, and it does lift those rich men high, and such men, good Lord! By the time I flung myself on a bench beside another man, I was half inclined to try anarchy for a change. The other was of more prosperous appearance than most of the men on such seats. Still, he was not what one calls a gentleman, and he had probably worked at some time like a human being. He was a small, sharp-faced man, with grave, staring eyes, and a beard somewhat foreign. His clothes were black, respectable, and yet casual, those of a man who dresses conventionally because it was a bore to dress unconventionally, as it is. Attracted by this and other things, and wanting an outburst for my bitter social feelings, I tempted him into speech, first about the cold, and then about the general election. To this the respectable man replied, "Well, I don't belong to any party myself. I am an Anarchist." I looked up and almost expected fire from heaven. This coincidence was like the end of the world. I had sat down feeling that somehow or other Park Lane must be pulled down, and I had sat down beside the man who wanted to pull it down. I bowed in silence for an instant under the approaching apocalypse, and in that instant the man turned sharply and started talking like a torrent. "Understand me," he said. "Ordinary people think an Anarchist means a man with a bomb in his pocket. Herbert Spencer was an Anarchist. But for that fatal admission of his on page 793 he would be a complete Anarchist. Otherwise he agrees wholly with Pidge." This was uttered with such blinding rapidity of syllabification as to be a better test of teetotalism than the Scotch one of saying biblical criticism 6 times. I attempted to speak, but he began again with the same rippling rapidity. "You will say that Pidge also admits governments in that 10th chapter so easily misunderstood. Bolger has attacked Pidge on those lines. But Bolger has no scientific training. Bolger is a psychometrist, but no sociologist. To anyone who has combined a study of Pidge with the earlier and better discoveries of Cruxy, the fallacy is quite clear. Bolger confounds social coercion with coercional social action." His rapid, rattling mouth shut quite tight suddenly, and he looked steadily and triumphantly at me with his head on one side. I opened my mouth, and the mere motion seemed to sting him to fresh verbal leaps. "Yes," he said, "that's all very well. The Finland group has accepted Bolger. But," he said, suddenly lifting a long finger as if to stop me, "but Pidge has replied. His pamphlet is published. He has proved that potential social rebuke is not a weapon of the true Anarchist. He has shown that just as religious authority and political authority have gone, so must emotional authority and psychological authority. He has shown—" I stood up in a sort of daze. "I think you remarked," I said feebly, "that the mere common populace do not quite understand Anarchism." "Quite so," he said with a burning swiftness. "As I said, they think any Anarchist is a man with a bomb, whereas—" "But, great heavens, man," I said, "it's the man with the bomb that I understand. I wish you had half his sense. What do I care about how many German dons tie themselves in knots about how this society began? My only interest is about how soon it will end. Do you see those fat white houses over in Park Lane where your masters live?" He assented, and muttered something about concentrations of capital. "Well," I said, "if the time ever comes when we all storm those houses, will you tell me one thing? Tell me how we shall do it without authority. Tell me how you will have an army of revolt without discipline." For the first instant he was doubtful, and I had bidden him farewell and crossed the street again, when I saw him open his mouth and begin to run after me. He had remembered something out of Pidge. I escaped, however, and as I leapt on an omnibus I saw again the enormous emblem of the Marble Arch. I saw that massive symbol of the modern mind, a door with no house to it, the gigantic gate of nowhere. How I found the Superman. Readers of Mr. Bernard Shaw and other modern writers may be interested to know that the Superman has been found. I found him. He lives in South Croydon. My success will be a great blow to Mr. Shaw, who has been following quite a false scent, and is now looking for the creature in Blackpool. And as for Mr. Wells' notion of generating him out of gases in a private laboratory, I always thought it doomed to failure. I assure Mr. Wells that the Superman at Croydon was born in the ordinary way, though he himself, of course, is anything but ordinary. Nor are his parents unworthy of the wonderful being whom they have given to the world. The name of Lady Hypatia Smith Brown, now Lady Hypatia Hagg, will never be forgotten in the East End, where she did such splendid social work. Her constant cry of "Save the children" referred to the cruel neglect of children's eyesight involved in allowing them to play with crudely painted toys. She quoted unanswerable statistics to prove that children allowed to look at violet and vermilion often suffered from failing eyesight in their extreme old age, and it was owing to her ceaseless crusade that the pestilence of "monkey on the stick" was almost swept from Hoxton. The devoted worker would tramp the streets untiringly, taking away the toys from all the poor children, who were often moved to tears by her kindness. Her good work was interrupted partly by a new interest in the creed of Zoroaster, and partly by a savage blow from an umbrella. It was inflicted by a dissolute Irish applewoman who, on returning from some orgy to her ill-kept apartment, found Lady Hypatia in the bedroom taking down an oleograph, which, to say the least of it, could not really elevate the mind. At this the ignorant and partly intoxicated Celt dealt the social reformer a severe blow, adding to it an absurd accusation of theft. The lady's exquisitely balanced mind received a shock, and it was during a short mental illness that she married Dr. Hagg. Of Dr. Hagg himself I hope there is no need to speak. Anyone even slightly acquainted with those daring experiments in neo-individualist eugenics, which are now the one absorbing interest of the English democracy, must know his name and often commend it to the personal protection of an impersonal power. Early in life he brought to bear that ruthless insight into the history of religion which he had gained in boyhood as an electrical engineer. Later he became one of our greatest geologists, and achieved that bold and bright outlook upon the future of socialism which only geology can give. At first there seemed something like a rift, a faint but perceptible fissure, between his views and those of his aristocratic wife, for she was in favour, to use her own powerful epigram, of protecting the poor against themselves, while he declared piteously, in a new and striking metaphor, that the weakest must go to the wall. Eventually, however, the married pair perceived an essential union in the unmistakable modern character of both their views, and in this enlightening and intelligible formula their souls found peace. The result is that this union of the two highest types of our civilization, the fashionable lady and the all but vulgar medical man, has been blessed by the birth of the Superman, that being whom all the labourers in Battersea are so eagerly expecting night and day. I found the house of Dr. and Lady Hypatia Hagg without much difficulty. It is situated in one of the last straggling streets of Croydon, and overlooked by a line of poplars. I reached the door towards the twilight, and it was natural that I should fancifully see something dark and monstrous in the dim bulk of that house, which contained the creature who was more marvellous than the children of men. When I entered the house I was received with exquisite courtesy by Lady Hypatia and her husband, but I found much greater difficulty in actually seeing the Superman, who is now about 15 years old, and is kept by himself in a quiet room. Even my conversation with the father and mother did not quite clear up the character of this mysterious being. Lady Hypatia, who has a pale and poignant face, and is clad in those impalpable and pathetic greys and greens with which she has brightened so many homes in Hoxton, did not appear to talk to her offspring with any of the vulgar vanity of an ordinary human mother. I took a bold step, and asked if the Superman was nice looking. "He creates his own standard, you see," she replied with a slight sigh. "Upon that plane he is more than Apollo. Seen from our lower plane, of course." And she sighed again. I had a horrible impulse, and said suddenly, "Has he got any hair?" There was a long and painful silence, and then Dr. Hagg said smoothly, "Everything upon that plane is different. What he has got is not, well, not, of course, what we call hair, but—" "Don't you think," said his wife very softly, "don't you think that really, for the sake of argument, when talking to the mere public, one might call it hair?" "Perhaps you are right," said the doctor, after a few moments' reflection. "In connection with hair like that one must speak in parables." "Well, what on earth is it?" I asked in some irritation. "If it isn't hair, is it feathers?" "Not feathers as we understand feathers," answered Hagg in an awful voice. I got up some irritation. "Can I see him, at any rate?" I asked. "I am a journalist, and have no earthly motives except curiosity and personal vanity. I should like to say that I had shaken hands with the Superman." The husband and wife had both got heavily to their feet and stood embarrassed. "Well, of course, you know," said Lady Hypatia, with the really charming smile of the aristocratic hostess, "you know he can't exactly shake hands. Not hands, you know. The structure, of course." I broke out of all social bounds, and rushed at the door of the room which I thought to contain the incredible creature. I burst it open. The room was pitch dark, but from the front of me came a small sad yelp, and from behind me a double shriek. "You have done it now," cried Dr. Hagg, burying his bald brow in his hands. "You have let in a draught on him, and he is dead." As I walked away from Croydon that night, I saw men in black carrying out a coffin that was not of any human shape. The wind wailed above me, whirling the poplars, so that they drooped and nodded like the plumes of some cosmic funeral. "It is indeed," said Dr. Hagg, "the whole universe weeping over the frustration of its most magnificent birth." But I thought that there was a hoot of laughter in the high wail of the wind. The New House. Within a stone's throw of my house they are building another house. I am glad they are building it, and I am glad it is within a stone's throw, quite well within it, with a good catapult. Nevertheless, I have not yet cast the first stone at the new house, not being, strictly speaking, guiltless myself in the matter of new houses. And indeed in such cases there is a strong protest to be made. The whole curse of the last century has been what is called the swing of the pendulum. That is, the idea that man must go alternately from one extreme to the other. It is a shameful and even shocking fancy. It is the denial of the whole dignity of mankind. When man is alive he stands still. It is only when he is dead that he swings. But whenever one meets modern thinkers, as one often does, progressing towards a madhouse, one always finds on inquiry that they have just had a splendid escape from another madhouse. Thus hundreds of people become Socialists, not because they have tried Socialism and found it nice, but because they have tried individualism and found it particularly nasty. Thus many embrace Christian Science, solely because they are quite sick of heathen science. They are so tired of believing that everything is matter that they will even take refuge in the revolting fable that everything is mind. Man ought to march somewhere, but modern man, in his sick reaction, is ready to march nowhere, so long as it is the other end of nowhere. The case of building houses is a strong instance of this. Early in the 19th century our civilization chose to abandon the Greek and mediaeval idea of a town with walls, limited and defined, with a temple for faith and a marketplace for politics, and it chose to let the city grow like a jungle, with blind cruelty and bestial unconsciousness, so that London and Liverpool are the greatest cities we now see. Well, people have reacted against that. They have grown tired of living in a city which is as dark and barbaric as a forest, only not as beautiful; and there has been an exodus into the country of those who could afford it, and some I could name who can't. Now, as soon as this quite rational recoil occurred, it flew at once to the opposite extreme. People went about with beaming faces, boasting that they were 23 miles from a station. Rubbing their hands, they exclaimed in rollicking asides that their butchers only called once a month, and that their bakers started out with fresh hot loaves which were quite stale before they reached the table. A man would praise this little house in a quiet valley, but gloomily admit, with a slight shake of the head, that a human habitation on the distant horizon was faintly discernible on a clear day. Rival ruralists would quarrel about which had the most completely inconvenient postal service, and there were many jealous heartburnings if one friend found out any uncomfortable situation which the other friend had thoughtlessly overlooked. In the feverish summer of this fanaticism there arose the phrase that this or that part of England is being built over. Now there is not the slightest objection in itself to England being built over by men, any more than there is to it being, as it already is, built over by birds, or by squirrels, or by spiders. But if birds' nests were so thick on a tree that one could see nothing but nests and no leaves at all, I should say that the bird civilization was becoming a bit decadent. If whenever I tried to walk down the road I found the whole thoroughfare one crawling carpet of spiders, closely interlocked, I should feel a distress verging on distaste. If one were at every turn crowded, elbowed, overlooked, overcharged, sweated, racked, rented, swindled, and sold up by avaricious and arrogant squirrels, one might at last remonstrate. But the great towns have grown intolerable solely because of such suffocating vulgarities and tyrannies. It is not humanity that disgusts us in the huge cities; it is inhumanity. It is not that there are human beings, but that they are not treated as such. We do not, I hope, dislike men and women; we only dislike their being made into a sort of jam, crushed together so that they are not merely powerless but shapeless. It is not the presence of people that makes London appalling; it is merely the absence of the people. Therefore I dance with joy to think that my part of England is being built over, so long as it is being built over in a human way, at human intervals, and in a human proportion. So long, in short, as I am not myself built over, like a pagan slave buried in the foundations of a temple, or an American clerk in a star-striking pagoda of flats. I am delighted to see the faces and the homes of a race of bipeds to which I am not only attracted by strange affection, but to which also, by a touching coincidence, I actually happen to belong. I am not one desiring deserts. I am not Timon of Athens. If my town were Athens I would stay in it. I am not Simeon Stylites, except in the mournful sense that every Saturday I find myself on the top of a newspaper column. I am not in the desert repenting of some monstrous sins. At least, I am repenting of them all right, but not in the desert. I do not want the nearest human house to be too distant to see; that is my objection to the wilderness. But neither do I want the nearest human house to be too close to see; that is my objection to the modern city. I love my fellow man; I do not want him so far off that I can only observe anything of him through a telescope. Nor do I want him so close that I can examine parts of him with a microscope. I want him within a stone's throw of me, so that whenever it is really necessary I may throw the stone. Perhaps, after all, it may not be a stone. Perhaps, after all, it may be a bouquet, or a snowball, or a firework, or a free trade loaf. Perhaps they will ask for a stone, and I shall give them bread. But it is essential that they should be within reach. How can I love my neighbour as myself if he gets out of range for snowballs? There should be no institution out of the reach of an indignant or admiring humanity. I could hit the nearest house quite well with the catapult, but the truth is that the catapult belongs to a little boy I know, and with characteristic youthful selfishness he has taken it away. The end of chapters 19 through 21. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Alarms and Discursions by G.K. Chesterton. Section 8, chapters 22 through 24. The Wings of Stone. The preceding essay is about a half-built house on my private horizon. I wrote it sitting in a garden chair, and as though it was a week ago, I have scarcely moved since then to speak of. I do not see why I should not go on writing about it. Strictly speaking, I have moved. I have even walked across a field of turf all fiery in our early summer sunlight, and studied the early angular red skeleton which has turned golden in the sun. It is odd that the skeleton of a house is cheerful when the skeleton of a man is mournful, since we only see it after the man is destroyed. At least we think the skeleton is mournful. The skeleton himself does not seem to think so. Anyhow, there is something strangely primary and poetic about this sight of the scaffolding and main lines of a human building. It is a pity that there is no scaffolding round a human baby. One seems to see domestic life as the daring and ambitious thing that it is when one looks at those open staircases and empty chambers, those spirals of wind and open halls of sky. Ibsen said that the art of domestic drama was merely to knock one wall out of the four walls of a drawing-room. I find the drawing-room even more impressive when all four walls are knocked out. I have never understood what people mean by domesticity being tame. It seems to me one of the wildest of adventures. But if you wish to see how high and harsh and fantastic an adventure it is, consider only the actual structure of a house itself. A man may march up in a rather bored way to bed, but at least he is mounting to a height from which he could kill himself. Every rich, silent, padded staircase, with banisters of oak, stair rods of brass, and busts and settees on every landing, every such staircase is truly only an awful and naked ladder running up to the infinite, to a deadly height. The millionaire who stumps up inside the house is really doing the same thing as the tiler or roof mender who climbs up outside the house. They are both mounting up into the void. They are both making an escalade of the intense inane. Each is a sort of domestic mountaineer. He is reaching a point from which mere idle falling will kill a man, and life is always worth living while men feel that they may die. I cannot understand people at present making such a fuss about flying ships and aviation, when men ever since Stonehenge and the Pyramids have done something so much more wild than flying. A grasshopper can go astonishingly high up into the air. His biological limitation and weakness is that he cannot stop there. Hosts of unclean birds and crapulous insects can pass through the sky, but they cannot pass any communication between it and the earth. But the army of man has advanced vertically into infinity, and has not been cut off. It can establish outposts in the ether, and yet keep open behind it its erect and insolent road. It would be grand, as in Jules Verne, to fire a cannon ball at the moon, but would it not be grander to build a railway to the moon? Yet every building of brick or wood is a hint of that high railroad. Every chimney points to some star, and every tower is a Tower of Babel. Man rising on these awful and unbroken wings of stone seems to me more majestic and more mystic than man fluttering for an instant on wings of canvas and sticks of steel. How sublime, and indeed almost dizzy, is the thought of these veiled ladders on which we all live! like climbing monkeys. Many a black-coated clerk in a flat may comfort himself for his sombre garb by reflecting that he is like some lonely rook in an immemorial elm. Many a wealthy bachelor on the top floor of a pile of mansions should look forth at morning and try, if possible, to feel like an eagle whose nest just clings to the edge of some awful cliff. How sad that the word giddy is used to imply wantonness or levity! It should be a high compliment to a man's exalted spirituality and the imagination to say that he is a little giddy. I strolled slowly back across the stretch of turf by sunset, a field of the cloth of gold. As I drew near my own house its huge size began to horrify me, and when I came to the porch of it I discovered with an incredulity as strong as despair that my house was actually bigger than myself. A minute or two before there might well have seemed to be a monstrous and mythical competition about which of the two should swallow the other. But I was Jonah, my house was the huge and hungry fish, and even as its jaws darkened and closed about me, I had again this dreadful fancy touching the dizzy altitude of all the works of man. I climbed the stairs stubbornly, planting each foot with savage care, as if ascending a glacier. When I got to a landing I was wildly relieved and waved my hat. The very word landing has about it the wild sound of someone washed up by the sea. I climbed each flight like a ladder in a naked sky. The walls all round me failed and faded into infinity. I went up the ladder to my bedroom as Montrose went up the ladder to the gallows. Sic itur ad astro. Do you think this is a little fantastic, even a little fearful and nervous? Believe me, it is only one of the wild and wonderful things that one can learn by stopping at home. Three kinds of men. Roughly speaking, there are three kinds of people in this world. The first kind of people are people. They are the largest and probably the most valuable class. We owe to this class the chairs we sit down on, the clothes we wear, the houses we live in, and indeed, when we come to think of it, we probably belong to this class ourselves. The second class may be called for convenience the poets. They are often a nuisance to their families, but generally speaking a blessing to mankind. The third class is that of the professors or intellectuals, sometimes described as the thoughtful people, and these are a blight and a desolation both to their families and also to mankind. Of course, the classification sometimes overlaps, like all classification. Some good people are almost poets, and some bad poets are almost professors, but the division follows lines of real psychological cleavage. I do not offer it lightly. It has been the fruit of more than 18 minutes of earnest reflection and research. The class called people, to which you and I, with no little pride, attach ourselves, has certain casual yet profound assumptions which are called commonplaces, as that children are charming, or twilight is sad and sentimental, or that one man fighting three is a fine sight. Now these feelings are not crude, they are not even simple. The charm of children is very subtle. It is even complex to the extent of being almost contradictory. It is, at its very plainest, mingled of a regard for hilarity and a regard for helplessness. The sentiment of twilight, in the vulgarest drawing-room song or the coarsest pair of sweethearts, is, so far as it goes, a subtle sentiment. It is strangely balanced between pain and pleasure. It might also be called pleasure tempting pain. The plunge of impatient chivalry by which we all admire a man fighting odds is not at all easy to define separately. It means many things: pity, dramatic surprise, a desire for justice, a delight in experiment and the indeterminate. The ideas of the mob are really very subtle ideas, but the mob does not express them subtly. In fact, It does not express them at all except on those occasions, now only too rare, when it indulges in insurrection and massacre. Now this accounts for the otherwise unreasonable fact of the existence of poets. Poets are those who share these popular sentiments, but can so express them that they prove themselves the strange and delicate things that they really are. Poets draw out the shy refinement of the rabble. Where the common man covers the queerest emotions by saying "rum little kid," Victor Hugo will write "L'art d'être grand-père." Where the stockbroker will only say abruptly, "Evening's closing in now," Mr. Yeats will write "Into the Twilight." Where the navvy can only mutter something about pluck and being "precious game," Homer will show you the hero in rags in his own hall defying the princes at their banquet. The poets carry the popular sentiments to a keener and more splendid pitch. But let it always be remembered that it is the popular sentiments that they are carrying. No man ever wrote any good poetry to show that childhood was shocking, or that twilight was gay and farcical, or that a man was contemptible because he had crossed his single sword with three. The people who maintain this are the professors or the prigs. The poets are those who rise above the people by understanding them. Of course, most of the poets wrote in prose, Rabelais, for instance, and Dickens. The prigs rise above the people by refusing to understand them, by saying that all their dim, strange preferences are prejudices and superstitions. The prigs make the people feel stupid. The poets make the people feel wiser than they could have imagined that they were. There are many weird elements in this situation. The oddest of all, perhaps, is the fate of the two factors in practical politics. The poets who embrace and admire the people are often pelted with stones and crucified. The prigs who despise the people are often loaded with lands and crowned. In the House of Commons, for instance, there are quite a number of prigs, but comparatively few poets. There are no people there at all. By poets, as I have said, I do not mean people who write poetry, or indeed people who write anything. I mean such people as, having culture and imagination, use them to understand and share the feelings of their fellows, as against those who use them to rise to what they call a higher plane. Crudely, the poet differs from the mob by his sensibility. The professor differs from the mob by his insensibility. He has not sufficient finesse and sensitiveness to sympathize with the mob. His only notion is coarsely to contradict it, to cut across it, in accordance with some egoistical plan of his own, to tell himself that, whatever the ignorant say, they are probably wrong. He forgets that ignorance often has the exquisite intuitions of innocence. Let me take one example which may mark out the outline of the contention. Open the nearest comic paper and let your eyes rest lovingly upon a joke about a mother-in-law. Now, the joke as presented for the populace will probably be a simple joke. The old lady will be tall and stout, the henpecked husband will be small and cowering. But for all that, a mother-in-law is not a simple idea. She is a very subtle idea. The problem is not that she is big and arrogant. She is frequently little and quite extraordinarily nice. The problem of the mother-in-law is that she is like the twilight, half one thing and half another. Now this twilight truth, this fine and even tender embarrassment, might be rendered as it really is by a poet, only here the poet would have to be some very penetrating and sincere novelist like George Meredith or Mr. H. G. Wells, whose Anne Veronica I have just been reading with delight. I would trust the fine poets and novelists because they follow the fairy clue given them in Comic Cuts. But suppose the professor appears, and suppose he says, as he almost certainly will, a mother-in-law is merely a fellow citizen. Considerations of sex should not interfere with comradeship. Regard for age should not influence the intellect. A mother-in-law is merely another mind. We should free ourselves from these tribal hierarchies and degrees. Now, when the professor says this, as he always does, I say to him, "Sir, you are coarser than Comic Cuts. You are more vulgar and blundering than the most elephantine music hall artist. You are blinder and grosser than the mob. These vulgar knockabouts have at least got hold of a social shade and real mental distinction, though they can only express it clumsily. You are so clumsy that you cannot get hold of it at all. If you really cannot see that the bridegroom's mother and the bride have any reason for constraint or diffidence, then you are neither polite nor humane. You have no sympathy in you for the deep and doubtful hearts of human folk. It is better even to put the difficulty as the vulgar put it than to be pertly unconscious of the difficulty altogether. The same question might be considered well enough in the old proverb that 2 is company and 3 is none. This proverb is the truth, but popularly. That is, it is the truth put wrong. Certainly it is untrue that 3 is no company. 3 is splendid company. 3 is the ideal number for pure comradeship, as in the Three Musketeers. But if you reject the proverb altogether, if you say that 2 and 3 are the same sort of company, if you cannot see that there is a wider abyss between 2 and 3 than between 3 and 3,000,000, then I regret to inform you that you belong to the third class of human beings, that you shall have no company either of 2 or 3, but shall be alone in a howling desert till you die. The Steward of the Chiltern Hundreds. The other day, on a stray spur of the Chiltern Hills, I climbed up upon one of those high, abrupt, windy churchyards from which the dead seem to look down upon all the living. It was a mountain of ghosts, as Olympus was a mountain of gods. In that church lay the bones of great Puritan lords of a time when most of the power of England was Puritan, even of the Established Church. And below these uplifted bones lay the huge and hollow valleys of the English countryside, where the motors went by every now and then like meteors, where stood out in white squares and oblongs in the chequered forest many of the country seats, even of those same families now dulled with wealth or decayed with Toryism. And looking over that deep green prospect on that luminous yellow evening, a lovely and austere thought came into my mind, a thought as beautiful as the green wood and as grave as the tombs. The thought was this: that I should like to go into Parliament, quarrel with my party, accept the stewardship of the Chiltern Hundreds, and then refuse to give it up. We are so proud in England of our crazy constitutional anomalies that I fancy that very few readers indeed will need to be told about the Steward of the Chiltern Hundreds. But in case there should be here or there one happy man who has never heard of such twisted tomfooleries, I will rapidly remind you what this legal fiction is. As it is quite voluntary, sometimes even an eager affair, to get into Parliament, you would naturally suppose there would also be a voluntary matter to get out again. You would think your fellow members would be indifferent or even relieved to see you go, especially as, by another exercise of the shrewd illogical old English common sense, they have carefully built the room too small for the people who have to sit in it. But not so, my pippins, as it says in the Iliad. If you are merely a member of Parliament, Lord knows why, you can't resign. But if you are a minister of the Crown, Lord knows why, you can. It is necessary to get into the ministry in order to get out of the House, and they have to give you some office that doesn't exist or that nobody else wants, and thus unlock the door. So you go to the Prime Minister, concealing your air of fatigue, and say, "It has been the ambition of my life to be Steward of the Chiltern Hundreds." The Prime Minister then replies, "I can imagine no man more fitted both morally and mentally for that high office." He then gives it to you, and you hurriedly leave, reflecting how the republics of the Continent reel anarchically to and fro for lack of a little solid English directness and simplicity. Now the thought that struck me like a thunderbolt as I sat on the Chiltern slope was that I would like to get the Prime Minister to give me the Chiltern Hundreds, and then startle and disturb him by showing the utmost interest in my work. I should profess a general knowledge of my duties, but wish to be instructed in the details. I should ask to see the under steward and the under steward, and all the fine staff of experienced permanent officials who are the glory of this department. And indeed my enthusiasm would not be wholly unreal, for as far as I can recollect, the original duties of a steward of the Chiltern Hundreds were to put down the outlaws and brigands in that part of the world. Well, there are a great many outlaws and brigands in that part of the world still, and though their methods have so largely altered as to require a corresponding alteration in the tactics of the steward, I do not see why an energetic and public-spirited steward should not nab them yet. For the robbers have not vanished from the old high forest to the west of the great city. The thieves have not vanished; they have grown so large that they are invisible. You do not see the word Asia written across a map of that neighbourhood, nor do you see the word thief written across the countrysides of England, though it is really written in equally large letters. I know men governing despotically great stretches of that country, whose every step in life has been such that a slip would have sent them to Dartmoor. But they trod along the high hard wall between right and wrong, the wall as sharp as a sword edge, as softly and craftily and lightly as a cat. The vastness of their silent violence itself obscured what they were at. If they seem to stand for the rights of property, it is really because they have so often invaded them; and if they do not break the laws, it is only because they make them. But after all, we only need a steward of the Chiltern Hundreds who really understands cats and thieves. Men hunt one animal differently from another, and the rich could catch swindlers dexterously as they catch otters or antlered deer, if they were really at all keen upon doing it. But then they never have an uncle with antlers nor a personal friend who is an otter. When some of the great lords that lie in the churchyard behind me went out against their foes in those deep woods beneath, I wager they had bows against the bows of the outlaws, and spears against the spears of the robber knights. They knew what they were about. They fought the evildoers of their age with the weapons of their age. If the same common sense were applied to commercial law, in 48 hours it would be all over with the American trusts and the African forward finance. But it will not be done, for the governing class either does not care, or cares very much, for the criminals. And as for me, I had a defensive opportunity of being Constable of Beaconsfield, with grossly inadequate powers; but I fear I shall never really be Steward of the Chiltern Hundreds. End of chapters 22 through 24.